My name is Chris Pockney, so I'm an ecologist with Biolinks Alliance, and I'm presenting tonight from Tangerang country. So I'd like to start by acknowledging their elders, past and present, and extending that respect to all First Nations people across Central Victoria where we work, and joining us tonight. I'd also like to introduce Cam O'Mara, who's going to be helping to run tonight. Cam is a project facilitator on our Heathcote Local to Landscape project. And we're really lucky tonight to also be joined by Annette Rapalski from the Odonata Foundation and Mount Rothwell Sanctuary, to hear about some of the really inspiring work that she's been a part of over the last little while. So we will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So any questions that pop into your mind, please pop those straight into the chat so you don't forget them, and we'll get to all of them at the end. And then depending on timing, if we can't get through all the questions, if we're getting heaps come through, then we'll take note of them and get back to you over the next week or so. So just before we get to Annette, I'm going to give you a quick overview and rundown of why we've chosen this topic and sort of set the scene for, I guess, what we mean when we're talking about rewilding, which is the topic of tonight's webinar. So I think rewilding has as many different definitions as people who are talking about it. Lots of people have different ideas of what it means, and the reality is it can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. So I think a lot of people's mind when they hear the word rewilding often goes to European and North American examples, which are often really large, both carnivores and herbivores being brought back into a landscape, and otherwise a lot of the time it's kind of this separation of people from nature and letting nature heal itself without our intervention. I think a key thing that makes rewilding different in Australia is that people are inherently part of it, and that's kind of reflected in the 70,000 year history of quite active land management that our ecosystems have gone through. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we talk about rewilding. It's not people and nature as two separate entities, but really quite intertwined, I suppose. And I suppose it's not we're just rewilding in a context that is a little bit beyond, a very single species focus or anything like that, but really thinking about strategically how different interventions, and that might be bringing back particular species, but how different interventions influence the function of ecosystems and landscapes at a whole. So we kind of got a feeling there's a lot of interest in this topic in the community over the last year or two, and we held an expert panel discussion event last year, which was a huge success. It was it booked out in no time. We had a big waiting list, and a lot of the feedback from that event was that the 60-minute or 90-minute discussion that we had, I can't remember quite how long it was, but that it wasn't enough, and there's too much to talk about, and quite a few suggestions to actually make a symposium out of that. So this year, that's what we've done. We'll be hosting a full symposium on the topic of how we rewild Central Victoria, and taking inspiration from projects outside of our area, looking at what other people have learned, and trying to inspire, I guess, the local conservation and land care and research community as well, into how some of these things can be applied in Central Victoria. So keep an eye out on our channels, our emails and social media and website and all of that for more details. We're just finalising a few things with this event, but it will be held at the La Trobe University campus in Bendigo on the 13th and 14th of September this year. So I guess just a quick overview to hopefully whet everyone's appetites for this event. So there'll be a full day of basically talks and workshops from. We've got some really exceptional researchers and practitioners talking on some of these topics and projects, and Net is a big part of that program. And the second day of the symposium is a couple of site visits that we're planning as well. So, as I said, feel free to subscribe to our email list if you're not already, to be sort of the first to hear about as we finalize this and start releasing tickets. But yeah, that's the inspiration, I guess, behind tonight's webinar, to hear from Annette about her experience, and to sort of launch our symposium as well, as something that we're really excited about, and hopefully a lot of you are as well. So I think that's enough from me. The reason everyone's here is to hear from Annette. So I'll hand it over in a second. Annette is the Biodiversity Director at the Odonata Foundation and General Manager at their amazing Mount Rothwell Sanctuary. She has a wealth of experience releasing and transitioning populations of native species, and I'm very excited now to hand it over to you, Annette.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the lovely introduction as well. I will dive right into it. I'll just share my screen. Oh gosh, hang on, having a few technical issues. Okay, is that working? Yep, beauty. All right. Thanks to Biolinks Alliance for having me. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of our land. So I'm presenting here from Wadawurrung land. Just want to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. I will start by just saying I think I've got about 15 minutes allocated. I talk a lot, and this is just scratching the surface of everything that we do. So I might be jumping a little bit and skimming through. So feel free to, save some of those questions, and I'm happy to answer anything that I do miss. Firstly, just want to probably explain how we're structured a little bit. So today I'll be talking about Mount Rothwell. Mount Rothwell is one of Odonata Foundation sanctuaries. So Odonata is basically a not-for-profit that has been established to pretty much scale beyond what we initially started at Mount Rothwell. So for those that don't really know, we were one of the largest feral sanctuaries in Victoria until probably about 7 years ago. We broke our own record and actually purchased a property that's double the size of Mount Rothwell called Tiverton. And since then, it's really inspired us to set up more and more sanctuaries and create this landscape model. And so Odonata Foundation was set up as the not-for-profit to really enable us to sort of scale this model, using the example at Mount Rothwell as a successful sort of heart and soul of the business. So we'll go into a little bit of the detail around Mount Rothwell and some of the challenges that were presented. I've been personally at Mount Rothwell now for I think it's 21 years technically now. So seen it from the early days, and we've seen how it has evolved and adapted and changed. There's certainly a lot of information there. But I'll get into the presentation, and and I'll see how we go with questions at the end. All right, so the project context is pretty much around how we decided to set up Mount Rothwell. And, back in the day when I was employed by Earth Sanctuaries, it was more so around preserving animals, eradicating feral animals outside of that or inside of the fence, and excluding them outside, and introducing native animals that were at the, were declining, and just making sure that they had a protection zone to harbour. So our project context still remains the same. And refocusing on some of the really endangered species in our local area in the Victorian basalt plains. So yeah, there are many secondary benefits to the work that we do, and not all of it is measured. Not much of it, in fact, is measured just yet, but it's certainly something that we're advancing. So we're really looking forward to see some of those impacts, those secondary impacts. And one of the things that we are, you know, tracking, and we probably have been tracking for the last decade, are some of the birds. So we've recorded, certainly over 300 birds. We've got 16 different species of raptors, and that's actually day birds, not night birds. So it's certainly, yeah, very prey heavy. There's a lot of food source within the conservation reserve. It's got a really large carrying capacity with the absence of foxes and cats, and yeah, there's animals benefiting from that. But I'll keep flicking. Then when we sort of going back to Odonata, you can see we've got a little cluster here, which is probably relevant to the topic today, which is rewilding Central Vic. So our focus is primarily within sort of that Central Vic cluster. So we've got a number of sanctuaries that we are working on, but certainly we are broadening up that whole southeast coast of Australia. So this is some of the work that the foundation are actually working on, beyond Mount Rothwell's fence. So this gives you, yeah, just a little example of the sizes that we're working on and the locations. And most of these locations have been allocated or selected due to their biodiversity values in those locations. You get a little call. This is a little bit animated. The location is critical. So when we're selecting locations, sometimes it's opportunistic, but a lot of the time we like to be a bit strategic about it. So what we're often looking for is different EVCs, diverse ecosystems. In Mount Rothwell's case, we do have 3 different EVCs. So the open grassy woodland, the granite outcrops, and the basalt plains. And this enables us to actually get a really nice suite of species to select to put actually inside. The Western grassland basalt plains, I mean, we're only 40 minutes out of Melbourne and 20 minutes out of Geelong, so wedged between the 2 major cities in Victoria, and something that we're seeing is huge encroachment from those cities, just bridging together, and we're seeing the loss of that really important ecosystem and all the species within. So the open grassy woodland actually remains as the most intact open grassy woodland in this entire region. That has remained unchanged for over 300 years. It's never been cleared. It was used as a sort of shelter or fodder for sheep back in the day. But the rest of it has been somewhat degraded, and there's been a lot of effort actually gone into it, particularly the grasslands, to actually bring them back to their sort of former glory. The granite outcrops are probably going through a bit of a battle at the moment. So I'll talk about that a little bit later around rabbits, which certainly is a lesson that we have learned, and going forward, it's something that we certainly take very serious when we're setting up a sanctuary and trying to rewild an area. So yeah, this basically goes through, lists the EVCs and pretty much what I've mentioned. Historically, the land was owned by the Chirnside family. So one of the top 10 wealthiest pastoralist families in the country. They were part of the Acclimatisation Society, which actually introduced a lot of the invasive pests, unfortunately. And it certainly feels like the ground zero site. So we thought it's actually a brilliant place to start for some of this recovery work. Yeah, so I'll go into the details. So we were lucky enough actually to find some remnant species. So, and these ones are still quite common within the region. So there's quite a few brush-tailed possums, ringtails, swamp wallabies, and eastern greys. Certainly no shortage. So that when we acquired the site, these animals were present. And there's probably a few more. Here we go. Yeah. So we had a remnant population of fat-tailed dunnarts, sugar gliders, and of course our invasive species. So cats were probably one of the more concerning species that were introduced. So we've got records of basically selective breeding with feral cats, where they picked the largest, most feral cats that they could find, and they selectively bred them together. And there's images of these cages in an old photo from some of the records that we collected, and it had this whole structure of, the larger generations of cats being bred. And what had basically happened was about 300 were dumped in the Yuyangs. So they became really problematic. And the reason for the introduction was pretty much to control the rabbits, which I'll probably go into, I think, the next slide or a couple of slides over. Foxes have obviously taken a stronghold. Melbourne's got huge density of foxes. And so these are probably obviously the three most threatening processes for some of our threatened species that we've been working on in the region. But we are starting to sort of open our eyes into other elements that may be at play, including things like climate change or, development or just, loss of variation in habitat. So, yeah, there's certainly a lot of elements, but some of the things that we're trying to work out is what can we control and what can't we control. So I'll go into a little bit of history on the rabbits, because this is certainly, and a lot of you will probably know all this, but the reason I'm probably putting a bit of emphasis on this is because this is probably our greatest challenge. And there's probably a lot of theories out there with, put a carnivore in and that'll control your rabbits. And it certainly hasn't been the case for us. So yeah, we are almost ground zero for the rabbit introduction. And a bit of history on rabbits is there was, I think, about 300 records of attempted rabbit introductions into Australia, and that was from 1788, from colonisation. And it wasn't only until about 150 years ago that it actually stuck, and that was from super wild rabbits from that landed in the backyard of Barwon Park by this man. We put his face there so we know who to chase for all the funding that we've invested in the program. So if anyone sees him, send him the bill, because it's been huge. We would have spent, pretty close to $1 million in controlling rabbits alone. And so, and if you look at the costs across the country, it's 100-fold that. So certainly one of the greatest threats that we've got, and we've certainly seen within our fence. And a bit of history on that is prior to the 1950s, quolls were so prolific. Certainly around the early 1930s, where there were hundreds and thousands across the landscape. And all these rabbit introduction attempts all failed, and there was record of quolls actually taking all these rabbits and predating on them. And so there was actually a halfpenny bounty put on the heads of eastern quolls, just to reduce the numbers of that predation, so the rabbit can establish. And what ended up happening is the bounty that was made available for quoll scalps eventually ran out. They couldn't keep up with it because there was just so many quoll scalps being handed in, and they ran out of money. But the numbers, it's believed that a mysterious disease came through and actually wiped out whatever was left. And on top of that, the pressure of foxes and cats just resulted in their extinction around the 1950s or 1970s, I think the last record was. So it's really tragic and really depressing. And I often think, if we had never had the bounty, would rabbits have ever established? And, you always think about that. But it's a lot harder now to go back and correct some of these issues, including within a fence line. We often get asked, if you put quolls in, do they eat your rabbits? And it's just not the case, because rabbits will basically outbreed the predation from a quoll. So the quolls have such a large home range that they'll never populate to the density that the rabbits breed and take ground in. So unfortunately, we have to provide significant assistance in the eradication of rabbits. So knowing that we had rabbits, we removed the cats, we removed the foxes. We got down to, I believe, about 21 rabbits. Um, and it was during the drought. So we're going through the 10-year drought. And there wasn't much vegetation. Somehow, a lot of these introductions, all these species that I've got on the screen, actually stuck. So the hardy animals, we introduced them all. There wasn't too much emphasis initially to put in anything with, we weren't doing genetic testing in the early days. So things like the Rufous bettong and the southern brown bandicoot and the long-nosed potteroo were introduced, and they established, and they actually populated quite well. Little did we know that conditions were actually horrible in the middle of the drought. The ground was dirt. We're not actually sure what they really fed on. And the rabbits were actually low in numbers as well. They couldn't really survive. So we managed to get them quite low. But then we got the rains in when the drought broke. I think it was 2011. And the place just sprung to life. The grass got to our knees, the invert species boomed, and all these animals tenfolded, all the threatened species that we introduced. And on top of that, the rabbits just also went through the roof. So we were tracking rabbit control techniques, and the problem with an area that has native mammals in it is you can't use traditional methods like baiting or ripping or fumigating, not without doing intensive monitoring. So the problem is all these guys will sit in a rabbit warren and share a rabbit warren with amongst a rabbit. So if we apply any of those techniques, will impact the native species. So we're sort of left with a couple of tools. One of it is shooting. So we have to try and shoot every individual, which is hard work across 500 hectares. And then we started to adapt our methods because we thought this is never going to work. The other method is putting remote camera traps on each burrow, seeing who's using it, and then treat it if no natives are inside. So, and again, when you've got a landscape dotted with warrens, we'll never keep up with it. And these are all hand collapsed and hand fumigated, so it's a really difficult task. And then we actually started thinking a little bit more, and we thought, well, let's use animals against animals. So we sort of started thinking about, all right, we need a carnivore. We need more carnivores. We've got the quoll in here. They're not keeping up. We didn't really know what was next. We couldn't really get our hands on devils, and we weren't convinced they were going to just target rabbits. So we thought, okay, something we can control and that's a safe tool is a dog. So we started training up detection dogs, and these dogs were trained to detect rabbits in warrens and navigate around all the natives. So our dogs are trained to the level that they will run through the grass and weave right around a bettong nest or around a quoll den, or right past a wallaby without disturbing it. And then they'll look for a rabbit and go, right, I smell a rabbit in this hole. I'm going to dig and bark. And so that targets us into targeting rabbits. We eventually were trying to test their effectiveness. So we had shooters and dogs, and we're trying to work out who was most effective. And they actually broke even tracking them over 4 years. They both resulted in 11,000 rabbits each over 4 years. So that gives you an indication of the density of rabbits in our 500 hectares over a 4-year period from 2011 onwards. But saying all that, the natives were thriving. So we were pretty happy with that. We went from 60 eastern barred bandicoots to, I think we hit about 1,200, which was pretty exciting. So the eastern barred bandicoot, I'm not sure how much people know about the history on eastern barred bandicoots, but they were thought to be extinct for 50 years, and then they were found in a rubbish tip. There was about 19 founders that were found, and they were brought into captivity and captively bred. And these pretty much supplied the source for a lot of these sanctuary sites that were established after that. So I think we got about 23 or 24 back in 2004. So they were sort of teetering up to about 60 until we hit 2011 and the drought broke. Bandicoots went to about 1,200. And then the recovery team started to dive a little bit deeper and thought, okay, we could certainly improve the genetics. And then we started adding a different layer on our conservation program there and started looking at how can we improve the genetics. And we've been working with Caesar Australia and Dr. Andrew Weeks, and he's done brilliant work in some of the species recovery around genetic rescue, which includes outcrossing eastern barred bandicoot. So for the fourth time, I believe, in Australia, we crossed the mainland eastern barred bandicoot to a Tasmanian eastern barred bandicoot. So two populations isolated for nearly 20,000 years, and we weren't quite sure what was going to happen. And we knew that the Tasmanian bandicoot was twice the size of the mainland eastern barred bandicoot. So we were sort of thinking logistically, do you get the male large one that's huge and a little female, or do you get the, vice versa? And sort of trying to, work out those real simple things. And then we thought, geez, is the female going to give birth to a giant baby Tasmanian bandicoot? So it was interesting actually to see how that all panned out. It all turned out quite safe. We used the little mainland girls and the big big Tassie boys, and they had a smaller litter size, but there was huge diversity amongst all the young, and they were reproducing really well. So Eastern barred bandicoots is one of our really amazing success stories. We boomed our population to probably about 2,000 here at Rothwell now. And we actually introduced about 34 what we call crossbreds or hybrids into Tiverton Sanctuary, which is one of our larger sanctuaries. And in 1,000 hectares, introducing 34 bandicoots 3 years ago, we now have about 4,000 bandicoots there on average. So 6,000 under our management, which is impressive over that time, considering how dire they were, only 50 years ago. So really exciting to see, some of these fence sanctuaries do have their benefits. It's halted extinction. It's, provided a safe space for them by just eliminating one or two threats and providing, nice habitat and land and vegetation. But it's also this amazing little research site where we can see the interactions between all these species. So, yeah, I suppose on this slide, the eastern barred bandicoot is a little bit different to the original three, where we have intervened and corrected the genetics on that one. And it is something that we will now do. So, I'm sort of trying to take you through a bit of a journey where, I suppose we're learning and we're intersecting on some of our decisions and then trying to change it and go back and apply those learnings. So it's something that we're currently creating with the southern brown bandicoots. We're working out, we've got the population, they're pretty happy, they're healthy. And now how do we intersect to make them fitter and feisty from a genetic point of view, which, yeah, we'll get advice on. Also looking at the Rufus beton.
Sorry, colleague.
Oh, yeah.
There's broccoli, there's this broccoli there, but I didn't have a chance to get this tonight.
That's all right, mate.
And there's pumpkins at the back door on your barrow.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if that was a question. I couldn't hear that.
No, sorry about that. No, it's sorted. You can keep going in there.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, looking at the populations just on these, and there's actually another slide with a bunch of more animals. Rufus betons, we've certainly got over 1,000 there. Southern brown bandicoots within our 500 hectares, we've got, we think about 600, and I think I said that last night to my team and they laughed saying there's a lot more than that. That's our conservative number. Long-nosed potteroo, so both the southern brown bandicoot and long-nosed potteroo have just boomed over the last couple of years. And it seems to be right across the board, whether they're inside or outside fences at this point. So I'm hearing they're doing quite well in Gippsland and other regions. So I think that may have to do with seasonal conditions, which is something that we also need to take into account. So yeah, we've yeah, we've had really good success, probably from the wet summers that we've had for the last couple of years. And of course, eastern barred bandicoots, about 2,000 of those. The others that we couldn't fit on the one slide, so we sort of spread them out a little bit. We have the southern brush-tailed rock wallabies. So this is really is, you telling this story surprises me every time. We've been working on southern brush-tailed rock wallabies for 40 years in conservation, or 30 years at least. And they haven't really exceeded beyond about 50 in the wild. Their greatest threat is foxes. I'm sure cats do play a part on some of the offspring as well. And, something we've identified on site is that they breed so prolifically. And what they do is they stash all their babies in the bush, and that makes them a little bit vulnerable to predators. But we started off with, and we only had originally about 38 hectares allocated for our southern brush-tailed rock wallabies. We introduced 23, I believe. And these are outcross genetic founders that were intentionally introduced as a cohort and selected for their genetic variation, which were crossed with southern and Victorian. And in 2016, 23 were introduced, and now we have, we believe, about 450 of those. So absolutely boomed. And we've set up another sanctuary and have started to introduce them into there, where we think they will reach significantly large numbers. So a species that is critically endangered, we are directly impacting and working to make sure their numbers are stable, there's diversity, and they're retaining that diversity through the populations. But they, only in 2019, they were in huge trouble, where we had the mega fires come through, and we had a fire running through the colony in Gippsland. We had the Brindabella Ranges fire, which was just doubling in size daily and roaring towards Tidbinbilla Nature Reserve, where we had super critical animals there, and only days to evacuate. And the last remaining population outside of, I think that there was a small population in Grampians as well. And that sort of left us as one of the primary sites that were holding southern brush-tailed rock wallabies. And I looked out pretty much our front gate, and there was smoke all over the skies, I think, all the way to New Zealand. And little did I know that here I thought we had a fire in our doorstep, and we were going to see the southern brush-tailed rock wallaby become extinct before our eyes. And this was a fantastic trigger for us to just go, right, we need to intervene on this. We need more than 3 sites, because 2 of the 3 are on fire. And so since then we've activated another site, and that's nearly 400 hectares allocated to southern brush-tailed rock wallabies, where we could potentially build up the population in the thousands. So it's super exciting to just make sure that we don't dwindle those populations down to a tiny cohort where they go into this extinction vortex, because there's minimal founders. For us, it really is a numbers game, and we need to get these populations up, which is where our fences are a temporary solution for that. Then we've got the eastern bettongs. They were actually part of the same rescue group with the southern brush-tailed rock wallabies. So we actually ended up collecting the animals from Avalon Airport that the Australian Defence Force flew over from Tidbinbilla to rescue those animals out of the fire. And we also managed to get some eastern bettongs that way, which we did our annual trapping last night, and we caught a lot. So they're doing really, really well. We've, of course, introduced our charismatic little eastern quoll, which was meant to be the topic of my discussion, but I do get distracted easy. So yeah, we're constantly trying to, clean up their genetics and bring in new founders. But an interesting little piece of information on eastern quolls is we were working with them since I suppose 2002, and we had a captive breeding program and released them. They had a tiny founder population. There was, I believe, only I think it was like 11 represented. So 11 founders represented in there, and they were inbred over generations. We partnered in with ANU and Mulligan's Flat, and what we ended up doing was creating genetic markers through Caesar Australia, and they actually profiled all the captive population, including all of ours, and in Tasmania, and worked out where the gaps were in Tasmania. And then our partners at Mulligan's Flat came in and collected populations which were outside of what was represented in captivity. So we've got this really great picture of eastern quolls in our partnership with Mulligan's and Mount Rothwell, and we've recently introduced him into Tiverton. And they're doing quite well at Tiverton and Mulligan's, but unfortunately at Mount Rothwell we have seen a decline. So despite the absence of foxes and cats here in Mount Rothwell, it hasn't actually worked to the eastern quoll's favour, and it's interesting because we have an abundant food source for them. There's insects everywhere. There's small mammals. There's mice. There's lots of rabbits and kittens in warrens. But there is more to eastern quolls that we need to know about than we know. So certainly they are one of our mysterious animals, but we are broadening our learnings beyond predation for them, and we are looking into, what was that mysterious disease that went through eastern quolls on the mainland? Is this climate related? Is there a symbiotic relationship with the quoll and something else that we haven't introduced or that we haven't connected yet with? So there's always something to learn from our experiences. Or is it just a trend, that we're not really seeing? An association we've sort of made to the success of quoll breeding is ensuring that there is a cold snap and followed by rain. And we just haven't had that in the last couple of years at Mount Rothwell, being in a double rain shadow. So these are some of the considerations we've had to have more recently. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but please feel free to interrupt if I'm rambling. We also have the spot-tailed quoll was a really cool one. We had a rabbit problem. We had an overabundant population of brush-tail possums. We weren't really comfortable with controlling brush-tail possums, so we introduced spot-tail quolls, knowing that they're arboreal. We figured, all right, spot-tails love possums. Let's put them out there, and we put tracking collars on them and watched where they went. And in the first night, they hunted brush-tail possums like they're meant to. And then they discovered rabbits, and they never touched a possum after that. So eventually all the spot-tail quolls ended up out of the trees and into the rabbit warrens, which made our task of controlling rabbits a little bit more difficult. They all had different hunting behavior patterns. So it seems to be related to character somewhat. So we had some that would hunt one, eat half, eat the other half the next day, hunt the third day, and do the same. We had another one that just collected rabbits. So we tracked him to a log, and he was the more shy, wild, and elusive spot-tailed quoll. And I found him sitting on a pile of, I think it was like 7 or 8 rabbits. And then there was another one that was just hanging out with the wallabies, but they weren't shy of him. The way I found him is, we didn't actually pick up the signal of the collar because of the granite outcrops. And the way I saw him is there was a circle of rock wallabies looking down going, who is this? So we actually found him just scavenging for a little while, and eventually he moved into a rabbit warren. So they were cool. We didn't put in a breeding population of a spot-tailed quolls. As probably most of you know, an individual ranges from anywhere from 350 hectares to 500. And given we are 500 hectares, we can probably support one. And so there's some of the considerations we take in, knowing that we have a high carrying capacity of native mammals in the absence of feral predators. We know that we could probably support a higher number of spot-tailed quolls, but we're still looking at potentially less than 10 or 20. And so the way we tested our carrying capacity for spot-tailed quolls is we put in males, we tracked the males, and we looked at a few things. So first thing was their interactions. So we were making sure that they didn't conflict, that they took up a different range in a different part of the sanctuary. We found that related males, so we actually had a father and two sons released. They actually moved into our we have a Ned Kelly film set. We get a few films, and occasionally they leave their sets. So those three actually moved into the walls of the Ned Kelly film set, and were happy just living with each other with no aggression. And I think it peaked to about 7. We haven't tested it beyond that, but we actually didn't get any aggression amongst them, and they seem to be supporting themselves in that ecosystem with all these species around them. And they're predominantly predating on rabbits. So there's a great paper out there, Run Rabbit Run, by Grant Linley, which you can have a read about, where we were collecting their scats, looking at their latrines, actually finding the animal in their dens and looking at what they were feeding on. And he analysed all the scats, and there's a little bit of diversity in some of those scats, but it was predominantly rabbit, and a little bit difficult to tell what was scavenged and what was hunted. And I think this might be the last slide on my diversity of animals in Rothwell. And I know I'm talking a lot here. So I'll get moving. But the bushstone curlew is a really cool one. We've been captively breeding them. And we're working with Australian National University and the Mulligan's crew, and Shoshana Rapley's been doing some brilliant work on the bushstone curlew. So she's managed to get these cool little GPS backpacks on them and tracking where they go, and doing these wonderful reintroductions into fenced reserves in hope that they function as anchor sites. So there's a population of about sure, we're up to, I think, around 20 at Mulligan's, probably more actually. We've got about 12 at Mount Rothwell at the moment. We've got 20 in Arana. So, and I haven't dived into our other sanctuaries, but on the big Australian map, we have a sanctuary called Arana, which is up past Bendigo. And that's got probably about 20 bushstone curlews in there. And they've done really well. The ones here are flying in and out. So they would fly out to the neighbour's dam and have a feed around the dam, and then fly back in during the day and roost under our woodland in the day. They're starting to sort of avoid where the foxes were tracking. So we did lose a couple to foxes, but most of them were pretty happy actually, just flying to the dam and back in. So we do have a little cluster still running around in the woodland, which is really nice. And we'll be, probably looking at seeding other sites in the future. So follow us on our social media, and hopefully you'll hear a bit more about those ones. So going back to sort of the rewilding, there's a lot to take into account when recreating an ecosystem. And there's a lot of learning, it's not as simple as taking away everything. You've got to work out what you put in first and what you put in last, and it's significantly different. A lot of people reference, sort of things like the Yellowstone National Park reintroduction, and it seems to be quite a reactive sort of reintroduction there, where you see a problem and you try to address it. For us, it's sort of been trying to restore the ecosystem function. So picking species that are playing a function in the landscape and enhancing the quality of that landscape, and then finding a way to potentially control or complete that ecosystem with predators after the fact. So, but obviously where we were wrong were these 21 rabbits. So the images below are quite impressive. There's the way we've had to get control of our rabbits is basically fencing 5 hectares at a time with this rabbit fencing in the first image. And then we intensely use our techniques of dogs and shooters and digging up rabbit holes by hand. And then we expand the fence and build another 5 hectares. And we're dotting these 5 hectares across the landscape, eventually hoping to hit the whole 500. But we've had a lot of trouble at our granite outcrops. As you can imagine, it's hard to fence and they sit in amongst the rocks, so you can't dig them out. So you got to wait for them to come out or fence them in. So you can see an image of where we've removed rabbits, which is on the right of the fence where it's all green. You can see the recovery there. And on the left, you could see where rabbits are still present. It's just bone dry, arid, overgrazed, and just not very happy. You can see our little team of dogs there, which work brilliantly. And it takes a lot of work, to do this, but at this point, it's our only method. The middle image is pretty much GPS warrens. So you can see the density of warrens that we're tackling. The entire landscape has basically, I say 3 or 4 levels. So even though we're 500 hectares in size, we're kind of supporting 150 hectares worth of animal carrying capacity, because you've got some living on top in the grass, you've got some living in the first story of rabbit holes, and then you've got another bunch of animals living in like the 3rd and the 4th story below that. And then occasionally, it's not uncommon to be digging a hole and the dogs will be at the hole going, there's a rabbit in there, and a quoll jumps out and they've got to wait going, that's not what we're getting. And then you dig and a bandicoot jumps out, same hole. And then you dig and a bettong jumps out, and eventually there's a rabbit at the end. So they don't mind living together, which is really frustrating. But the next slide over in the grey is what we fumigated. And it doesn't look as impressive as the yellow one with the dots. But we do things a little bit strategically as well. So knowing that some of these warrens are supporting some of our native wildlife, we don't want to destroy them all. So we need to target those warrens that are the big sort of mother dens, which support rabbit breeding. And so that's what we've targeted in the slide with the grey Cs on it. They're basically the mother dens. All the other yellow dots, we don't mind having a few holes because that adds the layers and it supports extra animals in those holes. And then you can support a higher carrying capacity. But also, if a fire was to come through, they've got somewhere to hide. And it's also a way they can thermoregulate. So when you do get those extreme temperatures of really hot days or really cold days, they can actually go underground and have some sort of stable temperature under there. There is a real obvious trend in winter, given that it is quite a rocky outcrop that recedes down to a grassland, that all the underground springs occasionally will pull down into the grassland and flood all those warrens, and everyone goes up to high ground. So you do see these landscape trends of the animals actually moving across the landscape, which is where we've got to be really careful with in the fencing. But I won't go into too much detail because, again, I can talk forever here. I'll keep moving. This is this is Tiverton, and I've put this here because this is a beautiful scenario. All those little black dots that you're seeing on the screen are eastern barred bandicoots. So this will be in an area that's less than a hectare. And there are who knows how many bandicoots. You can see it was actually one of our shooters that were out, not shooting bandicoots, of course, but we had a cat in here, and he had his thermal scope, and I think he's either shaking from the cold, if anyone's been to Tiverton know that it's freezing, but or he's shaking with excitement, as I like to think. But yeah, he's never been documented in this high density, having these little eastern barred bandicoots hopping around the landscape like they were. And the grass is quite long, so you're seeing him fade out behind the grass and then popping back up. It's quite a rocky terrain as well, so you're seeing these little dots hopping around, but there could be anywhere from 40 or 50 or 60 bandicoots in less than a hectare, which breaks all theories of bandicoots taken up a niche of 1 per hectare. And it probably has to do something to do with the terrain, the food source, the conditions, and obviously the absence of most predators bar a cat. So yeah, this is certainly one of the lessons that we're learning, that how do you maximize carrying capacity and get those numbers up high to retain the diversity in populations. I think we're sort of, sorry, I'm playing it again, but I'll play it again because just in case anybody missed it, there's a lot there. And I'm happy to, provide some of these clips if anybody wants to see them again. Oh, how have I gone backwards? Here we go. Oh, no. Having some technical. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I guess I just want to say thank you for listening. I do talk a lot, and I do get very distracted. And I just want to thank you all for listening if you're all still there. And happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Annette. I think we'll have some rapid fire questions to get through them. Try and cut off at sort of 7 p.m. So I'll leave the questions with Cam. And while we do that, I think there'll be a link in the chat just for a really short feedback survey, which everyone loves for the webinar. For everyone who's tuned in, if you can spare a few minutes after we're done with the Q&A, you can follow that link to help us improve these things going forward. But yeah, over to questions.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Annette. That was really cool. That footage was amazing. Just thinking about those animals running around like they used to is just so cool. So first question from Louise Barton was, are you helping any landholders with out of fence introductions of things like eastern barred bandicoots?
Was that out of the fences?
Yeah, on just private properties outside of fenced areas.
Not yet. Just because the threat is real with foxes and cats, they just don't have a chance outside of a fence at this point. We are currently looking at some experimental trials, but yeah, we're not really there just yet. Yeah.
So David Gregg has asked, does Mount Rothwell or other sanctuaries have a selective size-based fencing gate that allows certain natives to move in and out of the fenced zones?
Yeah, so in that map we saw the 3 different EVCs. We do have some dividing fences in there, and we did have tunnels, which we believe a certain size can shift through. So what we were doing there is trying to prevent some of the common wallabies and kangaroos moving into our old remnant woodland. But at the same time, what is really important to us is actually connecting the entire populations. So even with some of these rabbit fences, we need to keep moving them just to allow flow. So you are getting that genetic diversity amongst populations. And where they can't, we're actually physically shifting them over. So just to ensure there's connectiveness across the populations.
Fantastic. Megan Healy's asked, is there any opportunity to introduce healthy bare-nosed wombats into reserves to grow sarcoptic mange-free populations?
Oh, that's a good one. Which one? The Seymour property where I was referencing the Southern Brushtail Rock Wallaby site that we established post fires, that does have a population of wombats there. And we've got these really cool wombat gates surrounding them so they can go in and out freely. And certainly anything that we do come across with mange is all treated, and anything that we can get access to. So yeah, we certainly have that little program where we can have a little controlled population there of hopefully mange-free wombats.
No, I'm in Avenel and we have a big problem with mange. There's actually a mange foundation if anyone's interested and they want to do some work. They hand out kits so you can take action. Any thoughts on introducing dingoes by Oriana?
So we do actually have 2 pet dingoes. So they were integrated into our conservation canine team. Well, we attempted to. We worked out we can't train them; they train us. So we do use them for detection work on foxes, but we think it's a little bit too risky within our conservation reserves, as they're probably not large enough to support the range of the dingoes. Yeah, so we haven't done that yet within a fenced zone, but it's certainly something that we are thinking about. And there are other programs that we're affiliated with that are looking at potentially supporting wild populations of dingoes, which will be close to some of our sanctuary sites, and we hope to make them complementary. So yes, somewhat.
Very cool. So Megan's also asked, is there a minimum population of a species that ensures genetic diversity is maintained?
I think my understanding is that every species is a little bit different, but something that we like to do is just make sure we get over 500 individuals, basically. So, and the other important thing is to make sure that they're across multiple different sites. Eastern quolls are a little bit tricky to get to that number, and it's something that we've been striving to do. So when we set up our recovery team, the short-term objective was basically to get the genetics right, which we've done. The midterm objective has probably taken us a little bit longer, and it's to secure the 500 within a fenced site. We know they're secure, and then beyond that, we look at wild releases. But certainly, we're nowhere near 500 with eastern quolls. So it's a hard one for those guys, for the carnivores. But 500 is a good number.
Sonia Sharkey's asked, are you using game trail cameras to help monitor across areas on tracks through various areas?
Yeah, I think we've got about 65 operational, probably more now actually, around Rothwell alone. Tiverton's got about 40. We like to keep a minimum of 40 across our sanctuaries, but yeah, we've got two different models of camera trap alignments, and one's like fine tuning for a purpose, and one's just general monitoring. So the general monitoring's about 40 minimum cameras, and beyond that, we sort of can intensify it, or depending on where it is, we alter the numbers. But there's a lot, yeah.
Are you doing baited camera trapping as well, or just trails?
No, we do a lot of tracking. So most of the time they're targeted tracking, sorry. So, if we see an unusual hole or tracks or even tunnels through vegetation, that's where we put the cameras. We don't want to alter the behavior. We actually want to see the natural behaviors. We think there's more to learn from that than actually influencing the behavior of the individual. Unless you're targeting predators, then you want to think about lures and things like that. So if you are targeting a cat or a fox or a rabbit, you might, like, we actually use rabbit scats from other areas to lure in rabbits in front of cameras potentially when we're down to the last one.
Megan asks, just maybe this will be the last question, but does your NFP receive any government funding?
Yeah, we try to apply for grants where we can, but they're sort of touch and go. But yeah, we certainly accept any donations. And yeah, we like to work with all our donors and supporters. So probably not as much government funding as we'd like, but I think everyone's kind of in the same boat. So yeah, unfortunately not that much.
All right. We might wrap it up there. What do you think, Chris?
So one last question just came in from Linda about whether if raptors have any prey preferences between the natives or rabbits.
Yeah, I got a really cool story for that. I once saw, and no one believes me, but I did get this on film and I wish I put it in this presentation, 17 wedge-tail eagles in the sky as a flock. And they stayed for 4 weeks. I was told they were all sub-adult males or a group. And they spent every week hunting a different prey type. And the way we knew what they were hunting is they strung them on our fences. So when you did a fence check, you'd get 1 week of rabbits, and then you'd get 1 week of bettongs. And I actually had to call the state government and say, all right, they're targeting our rock wallabies now. What do I do? And this was when we had less than 20. And we were told we had all our volunteers standing around our wallaby colonies being live scarecrows trying to keep these wedgetails away. And eventually they moved off. So yes, they eat everything and it's selective, but we hope the day raptors hit mostly rabbits as the nocturnal ones will be asleep. But I did also see a group of 5 wedgetails around a bettong nest in a circle. And unfortunately 2 got eaten in that nest. So it's a bit of selection. We don't mind that. So yeah, natural predation we are fine with.
Awesome. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks again, Annette.